A catastrophic defeat of the Protestant forces in the first major battle of the 30 Years' War at White Mountain in 1620 effectively ended the Bohemian Revolt. Just a few days later, placards appeared in Brussels and Vienna offering a reward for news of a king run away a few days past, height medium, no beard or mustache worth mention, disposition, not bad, so long as a stolen kingdom does not lie in his way, name of Frederick. The placards referred to Frederick V, Count Palatine, loser of the battle at White Mountain, but arguably still king of Bohemia. Now he was a fugitive mocked as the Winter King after the brevity of his reign. Yet despite his situation, Frederick was reluctant to give in. His involvement in the 30 Years' War brought the conflict to the Palatinate, the Lower Palatinate along the Rhine to be precise. This territory, including the city of Heidelberg, was associated with the title of Count Palatine, who was one of the 7 prince-electors of the Holy Roman Empire and held the power to elect the emperor. So far, the war had been about the crown of Bohemia, also an electorate, but now the electoral power of the Count Palatine was at stake. This geographic shift towards Western Germany brought the conflict within the sphere of influence of the Spanish Empire, as their most important means to bring troops to the Netherlands, the so-called Spanish Road, ran dangerously close to the Palatinate territory. In addition, the 12 years truce between the Dutch Republic and the Spanish Empire was running out just now. In the end, the war in the Palatinate and how the Habsburgs handled it would both alienate Protestants in Germany and internationalize the conflict, bringing in most of the major powers of Europe. In this video, we will look at what is referred to as the Palatinate Phase of the 30 Years' War. This phase is crucial to understanding why the war exploded from a local conflict in Bohemia to a European catastrophe and German trauma, as the professor of political theory, Herfried Münkler, aptly calls it. For a closer look at the causes of this situation, we suggest you have a look at the previous 2 videos of this series, covering the outbreak of the war and the Bohemian Revolt. Last but not least, international support for Frederick was, if anything, essentially restricted to promises and talk. The Protestant King of Denmark did convene a conference in March of 1621 with James I, the Dutch, Frederick, and the major German Protestants all present. However, all their troops were only raised to defend their own lands, not to support Frederick. This Protestant attempt at solidarity was doomed to fail because the major powers were all at cross purposes. Sweden refused to participate at all. Denmark raised troops only to bully the Hanseatic towns in northern Germany into granting him toll rights over the North German rivers. But the Hanseatic League was the most important trading partner of the Dutch, who were of course alienated, and the Lower Saxons were worried too. At best, the Protestant monarchs sent money or allowed recruiters to enlist men in their territories. Population growth, bad harvests, and religious fervor were contributing factors why men entered their service in droves. To give but one example, according to the historian Peter Wilson, over 100,000 Englishmen and about 10% of the entire Scottish male population would fight in the war. Frederick had only 2 allies, and they were both in the east, the Duke of Jägerndorf in Silesia and Gábor Bethlen in Hungary. The latter was opposed by Bucquoy, while Jägerndorf was facing an ambitious young man by the name of Albrecht Wenzel Eusebius von Waldstein. An imperial army was stationed in Alsace under Archduke Leopold, 6,000 men strong and later supported by 9,000 Cossacks. A second Liga army of 12,000 men was raised under Count Anhalt, not to be confused with the Protestant commander von Anhalt. Anhalt was Tilly's second in command, and raised this army both as a response to Duke Christian's raiding in Paderborn and to shield Westphalia from the dangers of the resumption of the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands. Meanwhile, George Frederick raised a force of over 11,000 men at Kenelingen near modern-day Karlsruhe, and Mansfeld joined up with Frederick V, who had secretly moved through France to join Mansfeld at Gemmersheim, 22 April 1622. Structural factors drove this kind of recruitment. Underemployment was high in Germany, and food prices exceeded wages. The prospect of easy money and plunder drew in recruits, and there was little competition from other powers. Experienced soldiers were also available due to the previous wars and newly disbanded armies. All the while, Tilly's army had been reduced to less than 12,000 men by sickness and desertion. He was unable to take either Heidelberg or Mannheim. At the same time, Cordoba and the Spanish failed to dislodge the British defenders in Frankenthal. But Tilly could profit from the easy recruitment in Germany. By April, he had raised his numbers up to 15,000 to 20,000 men and again moved toward Heidelberg. Frederick and Mansfeld crossed the Rhine at Germersheim, slowly moving away from Tilly and hoping George Frederick would join them. But Tilly pounced at dawn on 27th April and caught them as they crossed the swollen Kleinbach stream at Mingolsheim, 10 kilometers south of Wieslach. The unfolding battle remained indecisive, but with over 2,000 casualties, Tilly lost far more men than Mansfeld, who only mourned 400, while he was facing an opposing force of 18,000 Liga and Imperial troops under Tilly at reshaped, Roswithow. Mansfeld engaged in 4 months of shelling and assaults. Although Tilly had superior numbers, his strength was diminished because Maximilian previously had withdrawn his best regiments to form a separate Bavarian army, leaving only ill-equipped militias in their place. In September 1621, Maximilian moved his troops towards Amberg, intending to trap Mansfeld against the mountains. This caused Mansfeld to flee towards Nuremberg with his meager force of 7,000 men. 2 weeks later, Mansfeld eventually arrived in Mannheim, while Maximilian conquered the Upper Palatinate without any opposition. However, fearing that the Spanish might take over the Lower Palatinate, Maximilian sent Tilly to pursue Mansfeld westward with a substantial portion of his army. The Lower Palatinate was well fortified, and any intruder would face a strategic issue. The region was divided by the Rhine. The key town was Mannheim, which was fortified and located at the point where the Neckar and Rhine rivers meet. The Rhine could also be crossed at Oppenheim and Germersheim. To the west of the river, several wooded ridges separated the Lower Palatinate from Mainz to the north and Trier to the west. Kreuznach safeguarded the path leading to Spanish Luxembourg via Trier, but the primary stronghold was Frankenthal, located west of the Rhine floodplain and opposite Mannheim. Following the dissolution of the Protestant Union, Colonel de Vere, an Englishman, commanded a force of 7,000 men to defend these positions. As the war shifted to Western Germany, both fear and hope for opportunity slowly escalated the conflict. In 1622, it almost seemed like armies appeared out of thin air. A Spanish force under Cordoba, a great-grandchild of the famous El Capitan, Gonzalo Fernández de Cordoba, moved against the Britons under Colonel de Vere at Frankenthal. Tilly retreated to Wimpfen while Mansfeld and Frederick managed to join up with George Frederick at Sinsheim on 29 April, which brought their full strength to 30,000 men. However, they failed to crush Tilly before Cordoba could reinforce him. Because of lacking supplies, Mansfeld and Frederick pushed towards Ladenburg, where a Spanish garrison was stationed, while George Frederick was to shadow Tilly. On the evening of 5 May 1622, Georg Friedrich caught up with Tilly. Coming from the southwest, he crossed the Bollinger Bach, which was swollen with floodwaters. George Frederick formed his men up in battle formation near Obereisesheim. He was overconfident and unaware that Cordoba had reinforced Tilly. He lined his men up behind 70 wagons, many mounted with small cannons. The battle started in the morning with artillery skirmishes, but these remained indecisive. At 11 a.m., Tilly and Cordoba initiated a general advance, but heavy fire forced them to retreat to the cover of the trees. After this success, George Frederick took a lunch break and called back his outposts, including those in the nearby woods. Cordoba seized this opportunity and occupied the woods with Spanish musketeers. The battle resumed as Georg Friedrich sent infantry to recapture the woods and launched a surprise attack with most of his cavalry from Obereisesheim. The cavalry's advance was shielded by thick clouds of smoke from ineffective cannon fire and dust stirred up by skirmishers on the plain between the two armies. Several Liga units broke, and the entire left flank began collapsing as George Frederick's riders spread along the hill to eventually capture the enemy artillery. Members of the veteran Schmidt regiment saw one of their comrades, who had left the ranks to relieve himself, suddenly come running, holding his trousers in his hand and shouting, "The enemy! The enemy!" The regiment quickly formed a defensive hedgehog, with pikes pointing in all directions while some of its musketeers rushed to man 4 abandoned cannons to their left. Georg Friedrich's cavalry became disorganized, with some circling the Schmidt regiment while others pursued the fleeing units. His infantry remained stuck behind their wagons, too far away to provide assistance. In the meantime, Cordoba's musketeers had managed to flank the end of George Frederick's line, threatening his rear. Ultimately, the greater numbers and experience of the Lega and Spanish cavalry prevailed, and they managed to slowly force George Frederick's cavalry off the field by late afternoon. The infantry launched a final assault around 7 p.m., targeting the wagon line. At that moment, some powder wagons were hit by the sparse artillery fire. The explosion scared many of the remaining infantry, who nevertheless put up a strong resistance, with the final detachment surrendering only at 9 p.m. Georg Friedrich's army was pushed against the swollen Bullerbach stream, surrounded, and by the end of the day had effectively ceased to exist. Only 3,000 managed to join Mansfeld, who finally captured Ladenburg on 8th May. Mansfeld crossed the Rhine temporarily to fend off Archduke Leopold, who threatened his new base in Hagenau in Alsace. Meanwhile, Duke Christian's army finally approached the Main River, but their path south to join Mansfeld led through the supposedly neutral Hessen-Darmstadt, which secretly supported the imperial forces. In early June, Mansfeld returned from Alsace and captured the Landgrave of Hessen-Darmstadt to force him to grant passage to Duke Christian's army. While Cordoba crossed the Rhine with most of his forces in the opposite direction, Tilly received reinforcements both from the Spanish corps from Bohemia and Untold, who had been following Christian's march from Westphalia. This enlarged Tilly's army to 30,000 men, the largest force he had commanded so far. On 10 June, Tilly blocked Mansfeld's northward march at Lorsch and then boldly abandoned the area south of the Main River to cross at Aschaffenburg. Moving past Frankfurt, he tried to catch Duke Christian, who was crossing the Hoechst Bridge, just west of the city on 20 June. Though Mansfeld reinforced Christian with 5,000 men, the combined force was still outnumbered 2-1. This time, Tilly systematically isolated the 2,000 infantry Christian left at Sossenheim to delay him, counting on panic to do the rest. The Hoechst Bridge became congested with wagons and collapsed after only 3,000 men had crossed. Christian then ordered his cavalry to swim across, which caused many to drown. Disorder even increased with the arrival of a Liga cavalry regiment, which was sent explicitly for that purpose. Christian lost 1/3 of his army, and many survivors were without weapons. Tilly repaired the bridge and continued to pursue the retreating army southwards the next day. Christian joined Mansfeld, but lost another 2,000 men, covering their combined retreat to Mannheim. The imperial forces captured the rest of the baggage. The battle's outcome marked a hard blow to the Palatinate's resistance. To make matters worse, Georg Friedrich had already opened negotiations for a pardon and had disbanded his remaining troops on 22 June. He abdicated in favor of his son. Mansfeld and Christian retreated to Hagenau, and Frederick cancelled Mansfeld's contract on 13 July 1622, under pressure from King James to appease the emperor. Tilly, who had captured Heidelberg and Mannheim after long sieges, remained east of the river, where he retook Ladenburg. Duke Maximilian had now gained control of the entire eastern half of the Lower Palatinate. Under pressure from Anhalt, Leopold, and the 9,000 Cossacks who had just arrived, Mansfeld and Christian left Hagenau and retreated through neutral Lorraine to Sedan. Renewed negotiations with all parties allowed them to enter Dutch service for 3 months on 24 August. The Paladins were supposed to assist in relieving the besieged Bergen op Zoom, the fortress that secured the Dutch salient south of the Rhine and supported the blockade of Antwerp. However, this required crossing Spanish territory, and they had already lost 11,000 deserters since leaving Alsace, which means that only 6,000 cavalry and 8,000 infantry remained, most of whom were mutinous and barely following orders. Cordoba had marched after them and blocked their way at Fleurus with 9,000 foot and 2,000 horse on 29 August. But after repeated attacks, the Spanish right gave way, and the Paladins managed to break through, yet they lost all their baggage, artillery, and most of their infantry. They reached Breda the next day, but Christian was wounded and had his lower left arm amputated. He issued a commemorative medal with the inscription, Altera Restat, I still got the other one. The battle was seen as a great Protestant victory, like Mingolsheim. Still, it had little impact on the Siege of Bergen, which Spinola finally abandoned on 4 October when it became clear that the Dutch could resupply the garrison by sea. Meanwhile, the British contingent in Frankenthal was instructed to surrender to the Spanish, based on the assumption that Philip IV of Spain had agreed to restore Frederick to his possessions. However, it soon became apparent that no such deal had been made. In February of 1623, Ferdinand removed Frederick from his position as one of the 7 imperial prince-electors and awarded his vote to Maximilian of Bavaria, a devout Catholic and loyal supporter of the Habsburgs. Maximilian cancelled Ferdinand's obligation to refund his war expenses of 12 million florins. However, Maximilian remained bound to Ferdinand, whose help he needed to secure wider recognition of his new status. Mansfeld, meanwhile, re-entered the struggle with new Dutch recruits by marching to East Frisia, and Duke Christian moved to Lower Saxony. However, diplomatic support for them was running out. Ferdinand even offered them peace, but they refused. In the end, Christian was caught a year later, in August of 1623, by Tilly while trying to escape to the Netherlands. He was forced to make a final stand outside the village of Stadtlohn. At 2 p.m. on 6 August, Anhalt deployed his forces, and the Liga artillery began to unsettle Christian's infantry. 2 counterattacks were unsuccessful, which allowed Tilly's veteran infantry to close to musket range, while the cavalry swept around the enemy's right flank. Christian's army disintegrated as it was pushed toward Stadtlohn. The fresh recruits fell on their knees, begging for mercy, but the Croats and Cossacks continued to pursue and cut down fugitives until the following dawn. Christian escaped but lost almost all his officers. Yet again, however, he would enter Dutch pay. Back in Hungary, Bethlen was hoping Christian would move eastward and help him. He attempted to resurrect the grand scheme of 1620, receiving a promise from the Sultan to send 30,000 Ottoman soldiers to support him in exchange for making Hungary and Bohemia a tributary state. This caused another panic in Vienna. Bethlen wasn't aware of that, and by the end of 1623, signed yet another truce with Ferdinand, which was expanded into peace in 1624. This ended the Palatinate Phase of the 30 Years' War. The Palatins were routed, and the war in the empire appeared to be over. Ferdinand and his supporters could concentrate on exploiting their victory. Frederick was forced to sign an armistice, while Ferdinand used this opportunity to assert his control over Bohemia, declaring it a hereditary possession of the Habsburgs. In addition, he confiscated land from the Protestant nobles who had led the revolt and launched a widespread Catholic counter-reformation in the region. While the land transfers were crucial, they overshadowed another aspect of Ferdinand's program, which involved creating 11 new princes. The new princes included a certain Albrecht Wenzel Eusebius von Waldstein, who would become quite an important figure in a few months' time. The electors were worried about this move because it was an attempt to pack a future Reichstag with Habsburg supporters. But they allowed the new princes to exercise their votes after they would acquire appropriate fiefs. Other land transfers occurred somewhat voluntarily because of the recatholicization, which simply prompted many Protestants to pack their things and leave. Those who were able to leave tended to be affluent individuals. For instance, the 150 citizens who departed from Vienna after 1623 owned property worth 300,000 flaws. These losses worsened the damage already inflicted by the war. With a sense of bitterness, the exiles hoped the war would go on. The transfer of land and titles, including the prince-electorate and the re-Catholicization, contributed significantly to the anti-Habsburg sentiment among Protestants in Europe. Many Protestants had supported Ferdinand in reclaiming the Bohemian crown, something they thought was his right. However, they now opposed Frederick's removal as prince-elector on the same legal grounds. Thereby, the conflict became one about the rights of individual states and rulers versus the emperor, or in other words, the so-called German liberties versus a seemingly absolute ruler attempting to expand his power. In response, a coalition of European powers, including England, the Dutch Republic, and Denmark-Norway, formed an anti-Habsburg alliance in 1624. This coalition was determined to halt the spread of Habsburg power and influence and end the devastating conflict that had already claimed countless lives and left much of Europe in ruins. They would achieve the exact opposite. Thanks for watching the video.